Give you a minute. Hi, I'm Jeannie Ralston. I'm the co-founder of Next Tribe, and it's Thursday evening, which means it's time to talk about a very exciting book, as we do every Thursday. And this Thursday, we have Beth Wetmore, and you're gonna love her story. I love her story because she's had such an incredible life. She's done so many things, and she came late to writing, to really focusing on writing. And she published her debut novel at age 52, and it was an instant New York Times bestseller. Wow. I mean, come on. It's so fabulous. So, and the book is about West Texas, where she grew up. And so we're going to talk to her about her writing it and what went into it, what she hopes we'll get out of it. So right now I'm going to ask all of you who are joining us to write your comments and questions, because you're going to have a chance to talk to her directly, and put them in chat, the chat function. And then I'm going to mute everyone. And then when it's your time to talk, I will unmute you so you can talk to Elizabeth yourself. So Beth, I keep saying Elizabeth, it's Beth. Just correct me if you need to. I'm putting everyone on mute, or put yourself on. Janice, I'm putting you mute. Okay, mute. And now I'm getting to Beth. And she and I are the only ones that are not muted. So hi there, Beth.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
It's just it's my pleasure, because you're a Texan, and Next Tribe is based in Texas, though I'm Tennessean by birth. But in honor of the subject of your book, I wore a special shirt. Can you see this? A special top. It's a bucking cowboy. I've been waiting to wear it because I love West Texas. I love a lot. My husband was born in Spur, Texas, as I was just talking to somebody about.
That is.
So I can't wait to get to your book itself, but I want to hear first your publishing story, because as you know, Next Tribe is for women 45 and older who are smart, engaged, who see so many possibilities still ahead. And you're such an inspiration. You had your first book published at 52, and then it becomes a bestseller. So it's just a fabulous story. So tell us a little bit about how you got to writing this, and then how it's been since it's been published.
Okay, yeah, I mean, by a lot of sort of, I guess, American letter standards, I started kind of late. I don't think I wrote my first short story until I was 25, and I, for me, writing was something I always kind of squeezed in around the edges of earning a living, or raising my son, or living my life. And I cracked a joke earlier that, you hear these wonderful stories about these 25-year-olds who sign these book deals and write a book full of wisdom and humanity, and and they cover all the universal themes, and I'm good for them. But I was not that writer. I am not that writer. I really had to get out and live and get some experience and have some adventures before I was even remotely ready to write fiction. So I began the book I worked on the book for about 14 years. I started it when I was pregnant with my son, actually, and I worked on it. It's untrue to suggest that I worked on it every day for 14 years. I did not. I often took long breaks from it to raise my kid or earn a living, or just frankly because I lost my nerve. It was incredibly important to me to get the lives of these women and girls right. And I didn't always know if I was up to the task for that. And my hometown, like a lot of people, is complicated for me. And so while I had grown up there, I realized when I started working on the book in very short order that as a child growing up there, I had not been able to see the lives of these women clearly. And actually becoming a mom was something that really helped with that. So I worked on it on and off for about 14 14 years.
And what else did you do? You were writing short stories, but then you had all these other jobs right? What else were you doing while you were working on short stories and on you're on the novel?
Right. Well, before I became a writer, I spent a lot of years waiting tables and had a variety of jobs. By the time I was working on the book, I was teaching community fiction workshops from time to time, and I did a lot of freelance editing. I've probably done more freelance copy editing than anyone on the planet. But it was a great job for me because it allowed me to work at home, and to be able to work after my kid went to bed at night, or when he was taking naps. When he napped, he was not a napper. So I did a lot of copy editing.
Okay. But you drove a cab, you painted, I like that. You painted silos, you did all
Yeah, all of those things, all of those jobs sort of predated my life as a mom. So yeah.
And so tell us about so you worked, it started as I'm trying to find, if you can mute yourself, let's see, there's somebody else over there. Can you tell us, so then it started as a short story, right? And so can you tell us where that was published and then how it grew from that?
So I've always thought of myself more as a short story writer, and I think you see the residue of that all through the novel. And so I had written this short story, the first 2 chapters of the book, with Mary Rose and Glory Ramirez, and it had come out, it had come out in a literary journal. But I kept finding myself coming back to it, and it's cheesy to say that I felt kind of haunted by these characters, but in fact I did, and I kept coming back and sort of mucking around with it. And then at some point I realized that as much as I loved the short story, that there were advantages to the novel that I'd never really considered, like the time and the space to really maybe explore an idea a little more. And so I kind of went with it from there. But there's actually another chapter in the book, Jenny's chapter, I think it's chapter 5, that also came out as a short story. And again, in that case, my experience was that I had this short story, and then I wrote about her daughter, Deborah Ann, who's a character in the book, and I realized, these two characters belonged with one another. So
that's cool. So it's been described, I don't know if you've described it, or maybe it was Jenna Bush who really loved it and promoted it, described it as a love letter to Midland or West Texas. It's pretty harsh for a love letter. Tell us about Midland and that area, and do you see it as a love letter?
I do. Part of it's because I see every piece of art as a love letter to someone or something, whether it's a love letter to an idea or a character or a place. I grew up in Odessa, which is about 25 miles from Midland, but it's really a world apart in terms of the sort of socioeconomic situation. I've lived in Chicago for about 18 years now, and when I talk to my friends here in Chicago about the oil and gas industry, they often have a picture in their minds of enormous oil companies and oil executives, and the environmental devastation they cause, and all of that is true. But the town that I grew up in was a working class, town in the oil industry. So I grew up surrounded by people who worked as roughnecks in the oil patch, doing that kind of hard and dangerous work. So the men, hauled pipes and drilled wells, and the women, that I knew growing up worked in industries that supported the oil patch. So they were waitresses and bartenders and, preschool teachers and that sort of thing. So it was a town that was an oil town, particularly a town that's a blue collar oil town, is a pretty rough and tumble place. During an oil boom, there's generally a real steep incline in crime, particularly crime against women and girls. There are a lot of people coming into town from all over the country, most of them men, most of them young men, who are looking to kind of make a quick buck in the oil patch. And of course, I didn't see all of this clearly as a little girl growing up there, but I did spend a lot of time sort of eavesdropping on my mom and her girlfriends as I sat out on the back porch after supper, telling stories and talking talking about their days. And so as a little girl, during oil booms, I would listen as they talked about who had a new job or who was able to sock away a little money for college for the kids, and then during oil bust, I would listen to them talk about, whose house had been foreclosed upon or who had lost their jobs, so that's kind of the background that I was coming to this book with.
So I wonder, you're talking about listening to your mom and her friends talking. Were these characters in some way based on them, or like, and if so, which one? Who's Mary Rose? Did you know a Mary Rose type?
All of the women, all of the characters in this book are amalgamations of women and girls I knew growing up. And Larkspur Lane, the street where much of the book is set, is very much modeled on the street where I grew up. But as these things go, draft by draft, of course, it became more and more, fictional all the time. But yeah, these were, it was a strange sort of feature of part of my childhood that just as a kind of an accident, I guess. At some point when I was a little girl growing up, there were almost no boys on the block. And of course, in that time, in that place, the men went out and worked in the oil patch. And so for several summers of my childhood, I found myself surrounded by women and girls of all ages who lived on that street. And of course, many of the women had jobs too, but they kind of came and went. And so all of these characters are kind of amalgamations of women I knew growing up and girls I knew. In a really early draft of the book, I thought that I would focus all of my attention on the little girls because I was about the same age as Deborah Ann Pierce in 1976. And one of the things that happened as I worked on the book was that I realized pretty quickly that the lives and the stories of the women on that street were much more interesting than the lives of the little girls. And so that was a kind of evolution of the book.
I actually, when I was reading it, I was thinking that you might be the DA character, that she might be expressing kind of how you were at that age.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of me in every one of the characters. Her love for the bookmobile was something that I stole part and parcel from my own childhood. The bookmobile was really a lifesaver for me as a little girl, and I often joke to friends that, if it weren't for the bookmobile and college radio, I think I would have been lost. But yeah, so I stole her love of the bookmobile, and also the kind of freedom of movement that she had of, being able to sort of hop on her bike and sort of be all over the neighborhood without any adults really watching or paying attention, which was kind of a feature, I think, of the 70s for a lot of us who grew up then. So just being able to move around,
Now, Mary Rose, I wanted to ask you about her. Do you, is there, when you're thinking about the character, is there anything in her life that suggested that she was going to be she could had something in her to take that kind of stand? I mean, at the time, I would think of most women, as you talk about when she has the meeting with the junior league or what the equivalent is, that most are just wanting to push it away. And I thought I was just thinking about her character a lot of, whether at that time there were women like that who would stand up that way.
Yeah, I mean, Mary Rose is a really interesting and complicated character to me because, on the one hand, she does something pretty heroic in the sense that she insists on going to the trial and testifying. The initial moment when we meet her and she opens the door to that little girl, I think one could make a pretty good argument that she's just doing the bare minimum. That's not a particularly heroic moment, and she definitely has her sort of pitfalls as a character, but one of the things I was playing with in the book was, the kind of shock to her system when the book opens. I mean, this is a young woman. She's 26 years old. She has a daughter who's 9. So she's a very young mother. She has another child on the way. Everything in her upbringing and her experience would suggest that she would and has, sort of fallen you know, into the same patterns of casual racism as a lot of her neighbors, and in fact her family, right? But there's something in that moment of opening the door and seeing, um, a real live, breathing, wounded little girl on her front porch. That's such a shock to her, I think, that it really jostles her out of, her ability to kind of play nice, I guess, and that was something I was very interested in. But I'm also really interested in the idea that, um, that we all have these moments, right, where we stand up and act in ways that are courageous, that are not in line with anything we would expect from ourselves, so.
Right. Yeah. So we all have, I think I heard you talk about it as we all have decisions to make, or inflection points where a stranger comes to our door. What do we do? And that, and what's interesting to me is reading the book. At the beginning, I thought, well, it's going to be Glory's story, but I mean, it is, of course, but it really, Mary Rose is the one that I just felt most, I felt like she was the driver of the action. And I guess that's true, right? It's just.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know, I wouldn't count Glory out. I mean, she's, obviously, one of the things I grappled with from the very beginning is, what does it mean to ask a reader to witness suffering? And having asked the reader to do that, what is my responsibility to this character to render her life and her experience, in ways that are dignified and real and true, and so with Glory, in a lot of ways, I see her as the real hero of this book. I mean, she stands up on the first pages and walks out and saves her own life, and there were some narrative choices I made in her, with all of that in mind. She gets the first word in the book and she gets the last word in the book. It may seem like a small thing, but for a writer like me who's so language focused, one of the choices I made was I tried to save some of my most beautiful writing for Glory. And that was pretty meaningful to me. But it's interesting because the more I'm out in the world with the book, the more I'm finding, and I think it's such a delight that that different readers attach to different characters. Like I've had quite a few readers talk about Corrine Shepherd.
Oh, yes.
And how much they adore her. She's actually one of my favorite characters too.
She reminded me of Olive Kittredge. Can I say that? Is that
yeah, that's an honor. Yeah. Yeah, she was a big surprise to me. I actually imagined her as a really minor character until pretty late in the process. I had imagined her as the neighbor who sort of occasionally walked across the street to, dispense advice and maybe deliver a piece of news that would sort of move my plot along. And once I started to ask myself some questions about her, she really, really rose up off the page quickly. And I feel like for me, when you work on a book for 14 years, one of the things that changes is you change and the world changes, right? And I think that, by the time Corrine came along for me, I think I had had just enough living and sorrow under my own belt to really understand her in a way that I might not have when I began the book earlier. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes complete sense. And it also, as since Next Tribe is for women over 45, and so she's kind of represents, that age group, that demographic. And I think it's interesting because it's almost like she's coasting or something. But I think maybe that was part of, what society was expecting, everybody, the whole atmosphere of the book is dealing with expectations of these women, what they're expecting. And I think her husband dies and it's like, they expect her just to go away or something. But of course, these days we are a bunch of strong, bold women. And I think that if she lived today, she'd be right here with us. She'd be on one of these Zoom calls and not wanting to coast, she'd have more options. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Well, she's a character who's so deeply entrenched in her own grief, and she was, to me, she was a very tender character, because I think it's possible, to sometimes reach a point where you feel falsely, of course, that all your big decisions have been made, and so when the book opens, she's both grieving for her husband, but she's also somehow made the decision that she's no longer really needed in the world, that she doesn't really have anything to give back to the world. And of course, that's patently false, but it was a feeling that I could understand and really empathize with as I was writing her.
Yes, no, and I think a lot of us uh, on this call understand that or can empathize with that. Um, I love what you said about saving your most beautiful writing for glory. One thing I was struck with is her repeating that idea of this is a war story. I mean, that was like it was powerful. It was so powerful, and I think that could be said for the whole, for everybody. And I was wondering, what do you see as the war? What was the war against? I mean, if you were going to talk about this as a war story, so.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it wasn't something I was really conscious in early drafts about at all. But there are first of all, there are a lot of veterans in the book. The book is set in 1976, and I had read somewhere in my research that the state of Texas, had more young men, sign up for and serve in Vietnam than any other state, and that part of West Texas, which even today is deeply, deeply conservative, and always has been, really, that there were a particularly high number of men from that part of the world. And also I have this, every writer has their thing, and I have this thing about veterans. They show up in all my work all the time. And so I wasn't really conscious of it at the beginning, but I did start to sort of meditate at some point on, the war that's happening, in this book against women's bodies, against their autonomy, against their sort of freedom of movement because of the city they find themselves in, and the kind of dangers, that they experience, or even not even just danger, but just the kind of everyday sort of street harassment. I mean, there's a moment where one of the characters talks about how during an oil boom, she can't even gas up her goddamn car, right, without being harassed by some guy. And so I really became interested in this idea. But also, this young woman, Glory, her uncle says to her, this is a war story, and he's talking about her story of survival, in this attack that's happened to her. So, yeah.
And talk about when you, are you making, I mean, is the major point, one of the major points is for us to, I think maybe I heard you talk about this, for us to think about the casual racism. Is that kind of one of the main thrust of the book in your mind?
Well, I hope there are a lot of thrust. I mean, the racism, yeah, I honestly, tackling racism in this book was something that that happened pretty organically, because I knew I couldn't write a story set in that place and that time without honestly grappling with the racism, that I saw as a kid every day growing up. And of course, obviously as a young white girl growing up in a white neighborhood in what was then a deeply, deeply segregated town, I didn't even know the half of it, right? I mean, my experience with casual racism was listening to it around me, but I didn't have the kind of direct experience that Glory and her uncle and her mother, experienced. So I knew I couldn't write a book set in Odessa, Texas in 1976 without trying to reckon with that. And it's a kind of a personal sort of peccadillo of my own, that I'm often surprised when I read novels by white Southern writers, that go on for 200 or 300 pages without really addressing the issue of race. I mean, when you read novels by writers of color, You know, it's like right there, you know, because this is part of people's daily reality, you know, and although things have changed, of course, the demographics of Texas are very different than they were when I was growing up. You know, in recent years, you know, there's been a real, a real attempt, and successfully by writers and artists of color all over the state of Texas and not just writers and artists of color, but to kind of honestly grapple with the state's incredibly complicated history, you know, in ways that are a little more honest than the kind of yay Texas, you know, kind of mystique that I think, you know, a lot of people, know about the state. So, but it was also, if I can just, but it's also kind of a case of the more things change, the more they stay the same. You know, one of the things that's changed in my hometown is the last I checked, about 54% of Odessans identify as Latino, which is a big change from when I was a kid growing up there. But the last time I checked, there wasn't a single city council member with a Latino surname, you know. When I set my scene with Mary Rose, where she has to drive to Albuquerque to get an abortion, you know, so she takes her daughter and drives 350 miles to access an abortion in 1976. And when I wrote that chapter, actually many years ago, that chapter happened pretty early in the book, and I ran it past a couple of my girlfriends. They said, you know, Roe v. Wade. I mean, this is 3 years after that. You're going to have to explain this to characters, and you know, and they said, you know, this isn't going to be meaningful to a real audience. But you know, if I went to my hometown today and I needed to access an abortion, I would have to drive about 350 miles. You know, so, and of course, then this plays down on class lines, right? Women who can afford to, you know, if you got a good car and you can disappear from your life, right? You know, so it was so very much, you know, as I was writing the book, it occurred to me again and again, you know, that some of the social ills, you know, that these women are experiencing in 1976, you know, remain. So.
Now, did you spend a lot of time back in Odessa for research? And
I did. I still have family who live there, so I go back as often as I can. And as I went back, you know, I would go down and read old newspapers, and I took long drives through the oil patch. I'd sometimes leave first thing in the morning and pack a lunch and be out all day long driving around in the oil patch. We talked a little bit earlier about, you know, the book is a love letter, and it took me a long time to be able to write this love letter. And my first sort of entry into being able to do that was falling in love with that land. So
yeah, and you evoke the land so beautifully. I mean, that's some of the most lyrical. It's just that, and you know, anybody who's been to West Texas, I mean, my husband's from West, you know, just the openness, and it's the vastness and the nothingness is so hard to capture, you know, because they're so, but you did beautifully. I also wanted to ask you, I heard you talk about that you love the novels of the West, you know, Westerns, and that you were trying to do a version of that. So can you explain that part?
Yeah, I mean, again, these are not decisions that I was really aware of, particularly not in early drafts. But there was definitely a moment where I you know, was mindful that I was trying to some degree to play around with the idea of the Western. As a little girl, I had a period of time where I really loved Westerns. So like Elmer Kelton and Larry McMurtry, and I still do. And when I was a bit older, Cormac McCarthy was important to me. But I also, you know, I think I was about 15 the first time I looked at one of those books and realized that there were almost no complicated women or girls, you know, and it was an absence that I felt keenly, you know. I mean, and don't get me wrong, there are other problems with the Western, but as a little girl growing up in that part of the world, that was the one that I, you know, I kind of saw most immediately.
So how do you see this as a kind of turning a Western upside down, or in what ways do you see that?
Yeah, and I don't know if it's turning the Western upside down as much as I'd like to think of it maybe as being a little in conversation with. But you know, some of the tropes of the Western, so the wide open land and the space, and there are a lot of guns in my book, but I've kind of sort of turned that on its heels a little bit. The idea of self-reliance, which is something I also wanted to play around with. You know, I meditated a lot in this book, particularly with the male characters, about how this kind of myth of the American West and bootstrapping and rugged individualism is a uh, is a kind of it's a recipe for suffering, and so this book is full of people, men who would literally rather die than ask for help, and how that sort of weighs on them, this idea that any success you have is your own, right, instead of your community. And so I really wanted to kind of play with all of that a little bit, but I also wrote some tall tales that in the book that are sort of sprinkled throughout the book, and they're tall tales, but they're about women and girls.
Oh, you did. That's right. You did. That was.
Yeah,
You
it
know
was
what?
fun. It was so fun.
I was so excited about talking to you. I forgot to ask you to do a little bit of a reading. I'm sorry. So let's do that. And while she's reading, you guys, this is a great time if you've got some questions to put them in the chat so I can call on you. We have a couple. But yeah, I forgot that I was supposed to, because I was wanting to hear your story so much. So go ahead.
So since we were talking about Corinne, who's the oldest woman in the book, I think I'll read a little section of hers. And this occurs pretty late in the book, and I don't think it really gives anything away. The easy way to set it up is that Corinne is chasing after Mary Rose in her car, and Mary Rose is chasing after Deborah Ann Pierce, who's gotten in the car with a young man and gone on an adventure, a young man that they don't know. And I'm not giving anything away to say that Deborah Ann is not in danger, and a reader knows this, but these two characters don't know that. So, and so this is toward the end of the book, and so all of these characters have kind of been through the ringer at this point, particularly Mary Rose. Corinne is an unrepentant leadfoot, accustomed to going at least 25 miles over the speed limit, even when she's in no particular hurry. Now she drives down the I-20 like death itself is chasing her. The speedometer's needle trembles between 80 and 85 miles an hour, but Mary Rose's white sedan is moving faster, and the distance between the two cars grows until the younger woman is at least a half mile ahead. With the storm moving south at 10 miles an hour, the women drive into a cloud of red dirt and bone-colored caliche dust. As they approach Penwell, the wind turns fierce and Corinne's car begins to shake. The motion roils her stomach, reminding her that she has not eaten today, that she is thirsty, that she drank too much last night and every night since Potter died, that she is an old woman completely unprepared to stop the world from coming apart at the seams. When they were standing in Corinne's driveway and Mary Rose spat out that word, bastard, her voice was flat as the land Corinne is looking at now, and her heart fell to her feet. She has heard this tone of voice a few times in her life, usually, but not always, from a man or group of men. And although Mary Rose is angry and afraid, and there's a little girl driving around with a man they don't know, it occurs to Corinne why Mary Rose's tone of voice sounds so familiar. It is not the ginned up, high-pitched rage you hear when a crowd burns a book or throws a rock through a window or plants a kerosene-soaked cross in somebody's yard and sets it ablaze. The flatness of Mary Rose's speech, the hollow affect, the cold and steady tone of voice, all are fear and rage transformed into wrath. Hers is the voice of someone whose mind is made up. All that's left to do is wait for the little spark that will justify what is about to happen next. All her life, Corinne has watched this poison move through her students and their parents, through men sitting at the bar or in the bleachers, through churchgoers and neighbors and the town's fathers and mothers. She has watched her own kith and kin pour this poison into their best glassware, spoon it onto the plates and bowls their ancestors hauled in wagons from Georgia and Alabama, all while proclaiming that they worked for everything they ever got and nobody ever gave them nothing. They earned it, living and dying in that refinery, in those fields. And they can't do a goddamn thing about the people who control the purse strings and hand over their paychecks, who can put them out of work with a wink and a nod, but they sure can point a finger at somebody else. If they say it long enough, in enough different ways, they might stop seeing the child of God standing on the other side of those words or buckling under the awful weight of them. Whatever gets you through the night or helps you turn your back so you can keep up the lie. Whatever lets you light the match or throw the rope over a strong branch and still be home in time for dinner and the football game. And while Mary Rose maybe has better reason than most of these fools and sinners to open the door for unbridled wrath, Corinne also knows this. One way or another, it will eventually kill you. But goddamn, you can do some damage on your way out the door. Corinne presses the accelerator and tries to close the gap between her car and Mary Rose's. At 95, her Lincoln shakes and roars like a jet. When Mary Rose slows down to make the sharp turn onto the access road and then guns the engine, what feels like an acre of dust is thrown onto Corinne's windshield. She slams on the brake and slides onto the dirt road with one last look in the rearview mirror. And for the first time in her life, she wishes that a state trooper would put down his newspaper or lunch and pay attention to her for one blessed minute. It is nearly 3 o'clock, less than an hour since Corinne stepped into her garage and well past the time of day when she mixes up her first whiskey and iced tea and heads for the front porch. When her hands begin to shake, another reminder that she has absolutely no business being out here, she laughs and beats her fist against the steering wheel. She should have driven directly to the police station or stopped by the 7-Eleven and asked if their phone was working. All she wants, all she has wanted since Potter died, is to be left alone, to slowly drink and smoke herself into the sweet hereafter. But here she is, an old lady with busted lungs and a dead husband driving all over hell's half acre in a Lincoln Continental going to save the world. It is so ridiculous that Corinne knocks her fist against her forehead and laughs until tears draw streaky lines through the dirt on her face. Well, shit, she thinks. Here I am. Oh, I think you're muted.
Oh, I'm muted. I muted myself so I wouldn't bother you. What a beautiful scene, and it shows it's just a great transformation of Corinne. I mean, bringing out for somebody who thought she didn't have much to give anymore. I mean, she's so wise, and she plays such an important part in the story and in lives. So I think that's wonderful. We have a couple questions. I'm looking for Ellen Beals? No, Ellen McKnight. Let's see. I don't see Ellen McKnight. We've got
Ellen McKnight is here.
Oh, there you go. There you are. Sorry I couldn't find you. So please, I wanted you to be able to talk. You had a comment.
Hi, Beth. I wondered if you talk a little bit about the book's resonance with To Kill a Mockingbird. I just think there's some really interesting aspects to that, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about it.
Oh gosh, that's not something I've given a whole lot of thought to. Maybe I should. I mean, obviously it's an incredible honor, and I don't think I feel a little bit about that comparison the way I feel about the Olive Kitteridge comparison, which is I don't dare think of my work in that way. This is a debut novel, it has its flaws, for sure, but I guess I guess one similarity would be, of course, these little girls, who are somehow sort of making their way through a difficult and complicated world, without really seeing the whole picture clearly. Yeah, I mean, I guess, I don't know. It's a good question, Ellen.
Didn't you make a reference to Kill a Mockingbird in there somewhere? Like her perfect Boo Radley or something? Or is that a different story?
I think someone else may have made drawn that analogy. And there are a lot of mockingbirds in the book, in part because they're amazing creatures and they're also all over Texas all the time. I really like mockingbirds. So the bird is in there a lot, but that wasn't necessarily, an intentional sort of attempt to draw anyone's attention or make a comparison.
Okay, I must have misread something there. But here Cheryl Freeman has a question. Cheryl, I just unmuted you.
Okay, I just noticed that in the chapters, Mary Rose's chapters are written in the first person, whereas the other characters aren't. And I just wondered, is that because it's her story, or
Mm-hmm.
if you could just explain that.
Yeah, these are all decisions I make pretty intuitively. And so I heard Mary Rose's chapter in first person from the get-go, and that never changed. There were actually, and point of view is something I do play along with, around with quite a bit. But every time I tried to play around with Mary Rose's points of view, it just didn't work. So I just left them alone. At one point, I had several chapters that were in the second person, and I actually made a conscious decision to move those into third person, in part because I felt like with 7 narrators in a pretty short book, I was already asking a lot of the reader, to come along with these seven different voices. But to keep Mary Rose in first person was really just a kind of instinctive decision based on what sounded right to me. I read aloud constantly as I'm writing, and I make almost all of my decisions based on what sounds right to me. So, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, no, and maybe that's why I was thinking that I felt her story, Mary Rose's story, so intensely, as maybe for me that first person. But
Yeah.
But I love how everyone comes together and everybody has their part, and all the age ranges of the characters. And I heard you, and I know that this is hard for anyone, and I heard you talk about this somewhere where you were most worried about getting Glory's story right. And I mean, I have a friend, Sarah Bird, and people in Austin know her, but she was writing a story that was a woman of color's story, and she was very nervous about that. So that is, I'm sure, something you've thought a lot about.
Oh, sure. I mean, it was, in a lot of ways, it was the first big decision I made, and of course, I've talked a little bit about drawing from the street where I grew up and the women and girls I knew growing up. But again, at that time, Odessa was a deeply segregated place, and so Glory and her uncle and her mom were the characters who were least familiar to me, and the first decision I had to make was, what were my motives for having this crime happen to a young Latina instead of one of the white girls in town, and of course it's a completely different book. I mean, just immediately, and I did not want to sort of look away from that, because while crimes against women are really, really peak in oil towns during an oil booms, those crimes are felt more keenly, for women of color, for women and girls of color. So when I made that decision, that this crime was going to happen to, a young Mexican American girl, then the next decision, about her point of view was an easy one, right? I knew that I was taking a risk by having this crime happen to her, but I knew that if I made that choice, I had to give her a point of view. Like the worst possible choice would be having this crime happen to her and then having her story filtered only through the eyes of the woman.
Yes, I see that.
So once I made that decision, then it was incumbent upon me to do my best, and that's what I and that's what I did, I did my best, and I made my peace with the idea that I might not get her right completely, that might be a flaw with the book.
Have you heard anything about that? Have you gotten any feedback?
I've been really incredibly fortunate. Most of the people who've reached out to me privately, have really been moved by all the characters and feel, like I did good job. You know, so but I'll be honest with you, and this is the truth too. This book had been out for about 3 weeks when I went to Google myself one morning, which I had been doing like every morning since the book came out. And I was like, you know what? This is a bad idea. This is a recipe for disaster. So I'll be honest with you. I'm really trying to get some traction on some new work. And I've really been trying to be somewhat diligent about staying away from, you know, I mean, if people send me a direct email, I've been responding to those, you know, of course, but I've been trying to stay away from, you know, kind of some of the news regarding the book, I guess, because I think it's probably just better for my writing, yeah, honestly.
I have a couple more questions, but for the title, Valentine, was that always your title? And did you, I'd be interested to see how you came up with that and what other titles you considered.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. It was a late choice, and it was one that I fell in love with immediately. I was interested in, there's a moment early in the book where, you know, the young man who's the rapist in this book uses that word, you know, to talk to her, and it comes up a couple of other times in the book. And so I was interested in her, you know, one of the things Glory does very early in the book is she changes her name in a very slight way, you know, as a way of trying to kind of seize back herself, right, in the wake of this terrible, you know, assault. And so I became interested in kind of the play on, you know, on this word Valentine, but I also became very interested in Valentine as a love letter, you know, and sometimes a love letter that kind of skates right at the edge of melodrama or sentimentality, which I think is actually kind of true for my own writing, you know, particularly in terms of the landscape and some of those descriptions that I felt like I was often just kind of skating right at the edge of sentimentality, but not in a good way, you know. And so I really kind of fell in love with that title, but it had other titles. One early title was The Earth is Flat, which, you know, of course, it did not occur to me that like that's a terrible idea with the whole flat earther thing going on. So so that one got tossed. And then another title was actually a title that I used for a short story called Where Are You From? And I was pretty attached to that title, but I really think Valentine really nails it. The only problem with Valentine is that there's a little tiny town in far west Texas.
That's what I was going to say. I thought that was when I heard it's from West Texas and it's Valentine, I'm like, oh, it must take place in that little tiny.
Yeah, no, and I know Valentine, and it's completely different from the oil patch. It's got its own thing going out there. It's in the beautiful Chihuahuan Desert. I think it's a little town of about maybe 400 or 500 people, and I'd forgotten about it. And by the time I remembered Valentine, Texas, it was too late. I was already completely committed to this title. So I've had a few people from Texas say, "Oh, you know, Valentine, Texas," and I'm like, you know, no, sorry, but yeah.
So tell us. Well, first, are there any other questions? I'm trying to see if you have a question. You can just raise your hand because I'm looking at the whole thing now. Don't be shy. Look at you, shy people. Come on. Nope. Okay. Any comments? Who's read the book and loved it? Who's not read the book? Okay. Who's going to get the book as soon as we get off the phone? I'm going to get off this phone. So tell us, but before you go, I'd love to hear more about what you're working on now, your new work.
So, so in the first several drafts of this book, Valentine, the book that became Valentine, I began the story in February of 1976, and it ended in March of 1987. So the book covered 11 years. And at some point I plucked about 25 pages out of it and set everything else aside. And I'd taken it through several drafts at that point. And I plucked about 25 pages out of it and set everything else aside. And that was those were the pages that became Valentine, which takes place over about 6 months. So, so I have all of this other material that I had worked on, and part of that was because I had imagined that I would tell the book mostly from the point of view of the little girls on the street. And again, realized in short order that their mamas were so much more interesting, something that I had to grow into myself, I think. But so the next book is set in 1982 in Odessa, and it's going to sort of align with the great oil bust that sort of devastated that part of the world in the 80s. And the girls on the street, Deborah Ann Pierce, will be about 15, which I think is an amazing, because while I'm not sure I can always write little kids very well, I feel really comfortable writing 15-year-olds. So, and I think that's just an amazing age for a character anyway. So that's what I'm working on now. So.
And what do we, when should we expect to see it? I mean, how far out is it? Or
well, I'm hoping it doesn't take me 14 more years.
I just wondered if you had like a huge, you know, now all these publishers wanting you and give me the next book and, you know, whatever.
I honestly don't know. I'm hoping it goes a little more quickly than 14 years. So yeah.
Okay, let's see. English Adkins, what a great name.
Oh,
English, if you can unmute yourself, because I can't find you. Gosh, there you are. Hi, English. Oh, no, she did unmute. Okay. Hi, English.
Hi. Yeah, I was just curious. Maybe you've already talked about this and I missed it, but when and why did you move to Chicago? And do you think it helped you to be there to find a publisher?
Well, I moved to Chicago because I had gone to graduate school in the Midwest, and my husband and I met and started to fall in love like just as I was finishing up grad school. And so we were really early enough in the relationship that I felt like if I headed back west, it was probably a done deal. So I agreed to move to Chicago for a year and teach, and let us see what happened. And it turns out it totally took. We've been together, you know, ever since. Our son is 15 now. But that was actually, so I moved to Chicago for love, actually. But I also fell in love with Chicago very quickly. And now, you know, have put down pretty deep roots here. It's the longest I've ever lived anywhere. As a young woman, I moved around a lot after I left Texas. And so this was really the first city that I really put deep, deep roots down in. So although I miss Texas. So I'm trying to figure out a way to do both.
And I love that in your bio. It's what just made me just laugh so much is where you said that you want to be bi-coastal, Lake Michigan and Lake Travis. Just cracked me.
Yeah, it's y'all certainly, Texas certainly does winters better. So
summers not so much, right? Okay, we have another question from Isol Harris. I'm trying to find you, Isol. If you unmute your, oh, there you are. I'm unmuting you. Oh, there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Hey, I just have a quick question. I'm not sure if you covered this or not, but what advice do you have for writers who are over 40, late 40s and 50s, in staying inspired to write? Because, you know, of course, in this culture, we're always celebrating people who are younger and who are, you know, their first novel is usually like in their 20s or whatever. But what kind of advice do you have? Because I think it's wonderful that, you know, you're finding success with your book at this point in your life.
So I guess my first bit of advice would be that you're not alone, you know, and I think for me, again, every bit of living, every experience I ever had, particularly my experiences as a mom, I really drew on every single one of those for this book. You know, this book took for me to write this book, I had to access every bit of compassion and hard-earned wisdom and effort. You know, writing doesn't come easily to me. I'm the kind of writer who can spend an entire morning working on a single paragraph and then throw it all out and start all over the next day. So I'm incredibly slow. So I guess I would say you're not alone, but I guess I would say the other, for me, you know, I had to understand at some point that my path was not other people's paths. You know, that I was on my own path and it was mine, and that, you know, and that this book was going to take every bit as long as it took. and there was no way to circumvent that, you know. And I also had to be okay with the idea that, you know, my life did not lend its, you know, mine was not a life that, you know, I couldn't hole up, you know, at my family's cabin, you know, and write my first novel. You know, I was always doing it around, you know, the edges of my life. And I think that's true for a lot of people, particularly working class people and women, you know. But the other piece of advice I would offer is ask for help. This book would not exist, but for a couple of really lucky grants that I got at just the right time. I got an NEA the year that my son Hank was 2 years old. And every bit of that money, other than the taxes, went to childcare. And I got a draft of the book that year. You know, I got an early draft of the book. I was fortunate enough to go to some writers' residencies, which allowed me to work without interruption for 3 or 4 weeks, and that was really a lifesaver. And at the end of the day, to finish the book, I asked my husband to basically take on a second job for nearly 5 years so that I could take on as little freelance copy editing as possible. And he did that for 5 years. He taught high school English all day and then drove up to the suburbs and tutored, you know, privately. And without that sacrifice, you know, this book wouldn't exist. So, you know, and I think for a lot of us, particularly women, asking our loved ones to sacrifice for our dreams, you know, is something that is very hard. You know, it was hard for me. You know, I'd been, before I met my husband and, you know, we married, I mean, I'd been pretty on my own for a really long time, you know. So yeah, I guess all of those things, you know, don't give up, you know.
Yeah, and I love what you were saying even before we started about the kind of, we were talking about that, how much wisdom you accumulate as you go through life and have these experiences, and there's so much more I think that you have to write about. But we didn't ask about how you sold the book, but I was just wondering if there was any kind of prejudice against it being, or no, it wasn't, it's not a story, but how was the process, I guess is what I should ask for you.
I don't think my experience is necessarily typical. I was very fortunate. Once I finally finished the damn thing, it sold pretty quickly, and it was really, and I was just really fortunate. I had an agent who found me. She had seen a story in a journal, and so she reached out to me, you know. And so in a lot of ways, I was very fortunate to skip some of the harder aspects of breaking into the publishing industry. You know, by the time I was writing an elevator pitch, the book had already sold, you know. So yeah, so I was just incredibly fortunate.
Well, good. Well, it's so inspiring and encouraging to hear about your experience, really, because, you know, I think a lot of us think there's a bias against older women's voices and older women in fiction these days.
For sure. Yeah, I agree. But, you know, I gotta say, I kind of think middle-aged women are having a moment. You know, I mean, I've been thinking about, you know, I mean, it didn't work out, but, you know, the way I wanted it to, but I was thinking about all those women who were in the running for, you know, the Democratic nomination. I mean, again, it didn't work out the way I wanted it to, but there were a lot of them, and they were all like incredibly qualified, you know. So I don't know. I mean, I think you're right. There is this kind of discrimination, but I'm kind of hoping that, you know, I'm kind of hoping we're all kind of having a moment, you know, so.
Well, I definitely feel that way. I mean, being with Next Tribe, that's one reason I started it, was just like, we've got something to say and we're going to say it. And I think that really when you think about so many impressive women at this age who are doing so much in so many areas, it's like such a rich time in our lives. And I think we should be celebrating it and making sure people pay attention, because we got a lot to offer, like Corrine.
Well, and y'all aren't done with me, actually. I was telling Jeannie before we came on for the live event, actually, I was poking around your website today because y'all are new to me too. And I was like, holy shit, I have to get involved with this. So I actually became a member today.
You did.
I did.
You became a member.
I did, yeah.
An honor, and I'll just do a plug then. It's just $29 a year, and it helps us keep going. And we have, you know, right now everything's a little harder because of what's been going on. So I really appreciate that. And if anybody wants to follow in Beth's path, I'd be so happy. And you can find that sign up on the website. And thank you so much, Beth, for being part of this. And we're going to have you down to Austin. I promise we're going to do something really fun.
I cannot wait. The minute we're free to move about, the Texas is the first place I'm going to. I've been terribly homesick for it. Yeah, I'm more homesick, oddly, since this book came out than I've ever been in my life. It's a strange sensation. It's almost as if like I had to like write the book and get it done and get it out in the world to truly be ready to come home. Does that make sense?
Oh, that's beautiful. Wonderful. That's wonderful.
So yeah.
And I will send a link to everybody who is on this with the video recording in case you want to show it to other people and so forth. But I thank everybody for coming, and thank you, Beth. We really appreciate your writing and what you've contributed.
It was a pleasure to meet y'all. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.